If there is a comprehensible world, it is possible for you to understand and explain it. We call this understanding and explanation wisdom. Let's mention maturity here. What is the book and what is wisdom? When he asks this, he says something very understandable. For example, he says, when it comes to the concept of God in relation to humans, in other words, when the relationship is between an infinite power and a limited power, and you transfer some of this power to the limited one, meaning to humans, Ash'ari theology has always tried to block this. So, what does it mean that God is called Al-Hakim, the wise? Maturidi and some of our other scholars interpret it like this. What we call hikmat, wisdom, is making the absolutely correct decision. That's the literal meaning of the word. So, what is hikmat? Accuracy. Think of it this way.
Hello to everyone from the Istanbul School. Dear viewers, today we will be discussing the concepts of wisdom and power. Our guest is Professor Dr. Şaban Ali Düzgün. Hello, Professor.
Hello.
Professor, today we want to discuss the concepts of wisdom and power again, this time in the context of the Quran. There are some verses that say God is wise, that he acts with wisdom. God is both wise and powerful, so what does that mean? How do we interpret these? What does it mean to be powerful, to be wise? What kind of consensus do we get when we consider these together?
That's a good, solid question. Because it's helpful to start like this. When we analyze the character of Ash'ari theology, which is mentioned among the theological schools of creed, we tell our students that it is a school focused on power. When we explain Mu'tazilite theology to them, we say that it is a theology that centers on justice, on God's justice. And when we talk about the Maturidists, we say that theirs is a theology that centers on God's wisdom. So, in fact, what emerges here are three different philosophies, three different worldviews. One of them emphasizes God's justice in his relationship with people. And it imposes a kind of necessity on God, saying that God must act in such and such ways for this justice to be realized. I'm talking about the Mu'tazilites here. The Mu'tazilites received a lot of criticism in this regard. The Ash'arites, on the other hand, say that God is all-powerful and capable of everything. Therefore, they don't see it as reasonable to look for wisdom, justice, or fairness in God's actions. Since, well, he is all-powerful, he can do whatever he wants. Sometimes we encounter this with our students as well. I ask a question. They say, "Teacher, isn't God powerful enough to do that?" or something like that. I say, God is powerful enough for that, for everything, so that too falls within his power. But when you say that, you're just making a statement without using your ability to understand, comprehend, or explain. This doesn't really mean anything. That's why Maturidi brings wisdom into the discussion and says the following. Actually, there are verses that all of us remember. For example, it is said addressing the prophet, "We gave you the book and wisdom." It is also said to Prophet Abraham, "We gave you in the family of Abraham, the family of Pharaoh, and everyone who came after, wisdom as well." So, the book is given, and at the same time, wisdom is given too. The book is used for Abraham. Book plus wisdom, in the end, forms sovereignty, governance, and authority. Or sovereignty. In other words, sovereignty means regime, it means governance. It's not about property or possessions. What do you need to be able to govern? You need a book. That is, there is a book that serves as the source for all norms. At the same time, there is wisdom that will understand, interpret, expand, and further develop it. Therefore, if there is a comprehensible world, it is possible for you to understand and explain it. We call this understanding and explanation wisdom. In fact, let's mention maturity here. What is the book and what is wisdom? When he asks this, he says something very understandable. For example, he says, when you open and read the Quran, we call this Al-Kitabu al-Madlu, meaning the recited book. When you read a verse, that's Al-Kitabu al-Madlu. But what you derive, understand, and interpret from those words you read is called wisdom, he says. So, what is there in wisdom? There is an effort involved. And because something understandable and explainable has been placed within it, I am able to understand and explain it. In this way, the book also stands as a kind of database that opens itself up to me and allows me to extract and obtain wisdom from it. Now, the giving of wisdom to the prophet, to whomever wisdom is given. Whoever is given wisdom has truly been given much good. It is said that whoever is given wisdom has been granted a great favor. So then, the aspect of wisdom that concerns me, that concerns a person, is this. When a person takes what exists, examines it, and as a result of their effort to explain something that is not immediately visible there, something new emerges from it, and this leads to the production of new knowledge. This is wisdom. And it is said that whoever is given such a power and ability has truly been granted a great favor. This is perfect. So, what does Allah's name Al-Hakim mean? Maturidi and other scholars interpret it like this. Wisdom, they say, is about making the absolutely correct decision. That's the meaning of the word. What is wisdom? Accuracy. Think of it this way. We go to the doctor. We have a health issue. First, the doctor will make a diagnosis. Then, based on that, they'll provide treatment. If the diagnosis is wrong, the treatment will be wrong too. In other words, things get worse instead of better. But when the diagnosis is correct, because it's spot on, that doctor is considered wise. So, a doctor, but what kind of doctor? A hakim, a doctor with wisdom. Spot on. That's the kind of doctor we're looking for. The same applies to the judge, the magistrate. Hikmet, wisdom, and hakim, judge, come from the same root. Now, the judge listens to all the claims from both the plaintiff and the defendant, listens carefully, and finally makes a decision. He makes a decision about the defendant. When the judge gives a sentence that does not harm justice, does not compromise dignity, and does not go beyond the bounds of fairness, that's when we call him a true hakim, meaning he has hit the mark perfectly. In other words, a judge who acts with complete wisdom. The word hakim, or wise, is not a title that can be given to just anyone. For example, our Sistani talks about this. There are these hakim or philosopher names in Greek philosophy. We list and mention dozens of them, but he says that only 5 of them are given the title hakim. Look, we don't call every judge a hakim, meaning a possessor of wisdom. We don't call every doctor a hakim either. He says that only Empedocles, Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle qualify. He says that apart from these 5, we don't call anyone in Greek philosophy a hakim. So, why is that? Because being given wisdom means that a great favor has been bestowed upon that person. It's a blessing, and not everyone is fortunate enough to receive it. They're a bit stingy when it comes to using that title. This also relates to wisdom in terms of what God does and creates. Now, as we said, when it comes to accuracy for us, whatever we do, if we do it right, if we get it right, then we are acting with wisdom. So how should we interpret God being referred to as Hakim, the possessor of wisdom? We interpret it like this. According to Maturidi, whose interpretation I really appreciate and want to highlight here, he says that God does not create existence just for it to be destroyed. No one creates something just so that it will disappear after a while and vanish completely. That would go against his wisdom. Wisdom means that if you create something, you do so for it to exist eternally, not so that it will cease to exist. Otherwise, it would be foolishness, and that is not befitting of God. Therefore, this sense of eternity points to a new realm of existence after this world. In other words, we mean the afterlife. Maturidi correctly attributes its emergence and the satisfaction of the feeling of eternity in this way to the wisdom of Allah. He says that the right course of action here is that the fulfillment of the sense of immortality within a person is in accordance with wisdom. This is what accuracy is. Spot on. So, in summary, we talked about the earlier schools that set wisdom and power against each other. Let's put it this way. Let's say there's a chain of causes. A chain of causes. So, how can you explain the occurrence of rain? We explain it. Evaporation, rising up, then clouds and so on up there. I can describe to you all those meteorological processes we know. I know them and I explain them. There's a process that can be grasped, understood, and explained. It's clear and transparent to me. I'm not saying, well, it's within God's power. He makes it rain whenever he wants. Look, I'm not saying that. So, the existence of a chain of causes, the presence of the links in that chain, the process being clear to me, my participation in that process, look, I have knowledge about it. I can predict the process. I can make judgments about it. Wisdom and judgment come from the same root. The fact that he has made it clear to me is because God is the wise, Al-Hakim. So, the word Hakim, God being the wise, means, for example, that for all the beings he creates, God not only brings them into existence, but also places within them an inner light that allows them to sustain their lives. He created and then guided. He creates. And inside, it's just like when you make a phone and give it to someone. Then you install its entire operating system and applications so that it functions according to its purpose. You bring a being into the world, you create it. This is a child, something we all observe. Who teaches a child, right after birth, to immediately go for its mother's breast? Or who teaches baby turtles, as soon as they hatch from their eggs, to head straight for the water? It is said, Halika fe heda, meaning he places an inner light in everything he creates, and this is considered his wisdom. So, wisdom means this: there is no action without a reason, cause, or explanation. Everything is presented to us in a way that can be understood and explained. This is God sharing his name Hakim, the wise, with us, making the system transparent for us. Because now God is Hakim. But at the same time, the system says that I am the one who produces wisdom. Our system, in other words, God establishes wisdom, God produces wisdom. But at the same time, as I said, according to Maturidi, the verse you read from the book is a statement that is recited. But what you derive from it is your own wisdom, he says. He says, wisdom was given to the prophets, to people, to Luqman, wisdom. Luqman is not a prophet, but it says, we gave wisdom to Luqman. In this way, wisdom becomes something you produce for yourself, like a kind of added value. And it becomes a distinction, a form of identity. The more wise you are, the more it points to your ability to decipher and understand things that seem closed off or incomprehensible to most people.
Actually, I understood it as a power of comprehension, an inner motivation, a kind of understanding, an ability to interpret. But there's something I didn't quite get, Professor. You say spot on, and you explained it with the concept of accuracy. When we say accuracy, shouldn't it mean revealing things exactly as they are? Because otherwise, I understand wisdom as a power that can take things even further than what they are. Is this the same as accuracy, or does it have a more extreme interpretation?
Yes, that's a good point. There are two things here. First, what we call accuracy expresses the complete correctness of the judgment you make. Here, it's about complete correctness. In other words, it's not open to interpretation. What you've stated is exactly it. But on the other hand, what I'm saying about wisdom, about clarity and wisdom, or my main emphasis on a person being a source of wisdom is this. There are things in what God does, in the system He has established, that cannot be explained. So when you can't explain it, what do you say? God is all-powerful. He willed it this way. Now, we're saying that this statement isn't correct. So, can you question God's wisdom or not?
You can do it.
Now, according to the Asherites, you cannot question God's wisdom. According to the Machaerites, you can question God's wisdom. So, these are two different worldviews. This is what we've actually been trying to explain all along. In other words, God's wisdom can be questioned. Oh Lord, why did you do this? Let me ask you a question. When religion comes into play, it's as if there are some things that can't be understood, can't be explained, that seem mysterious or secret, and that sets it apart from everything else. It's like, let it be that way, that's just how it is. For example, when the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard lays out those stages, the ethical stage, the aesthetic stage, and finally the religious stage. The religious stage he talks about operates very differently from the others. There's a bit of the unknown, a bit of mystery, secrecy, and things like that involved there. It's something that's closed off to human reason. But what we're talking about here, what Machaerides says, is God's wisdom can be questioned. Let me give an example, a very sad one, actually. This is an example from Al-Ghazali in his book Al-Iqtisad fi al-I'tiqad. Imagine a person who has lived an exemplary life, a truly perfect human being. The kind of person you'd call a complete or ideal human being. And this man died and passed away. If God wills, can you put this man in hell for eternity? This man was a good person. Everyone testifies to that. A good man. If God wills, can you put him in hell forever? If I asked you this, what would you say?
If He wills, He can, but He wouldn't.
Blah, blah. If He wills, He can. He'll put him there. Why? Because He has the power.
Yes.
Machaerides says He cannot. Why? Because it goes against His wisdom.
A situation contradicting His wisdom.
It goes against His wisdom. You've said everything. You set the rules, established principles. You said those who these things face consequences. And the person lived as a good human being, taking that into account. We'll explain the wisdom behind that. Why are you there? His wisdom requires that He puts him in His paradise. You could also ask the exact opposite. A man who oppressed everyone and acted unjustly his whole life died. If God wills, can you put this person in paradise forever? Now, the Asherites say He can. Why? Because He possesses absolute power. Machaerides says no, He doesn't, He can't. Why? Because it goes against His wisdom. Look, if you want to understand or present the concept of God as the founder of a comprehensible, explainable system, you highlight the word wisdom. No, they say, if His power is sufficient for everything. But that's not a good explanation. What Ghazali says behind this is the following. He says, just like you can't ask the king, why did you do this? You can't ask God either. He says, oh, in my opinion, this explanation makes the whole system collapse. So, when you compare a king to God, that's the kind of conclusion you end up with. That's why. Why did we consider wisdom together with power? Because wisdom is something that can be explained. It gives us the ability to see, understand, and appreciate what God does in a certain sense. Otherwise, it works like a closed system within itself.
I mean, when you compare it to a king, it's actually a wrong comparison because we know a king doesn't have infinite power. But on the other hand,
He could also act like a despot, the king, I mean, just because you can't speak up. Is there really such a thing?
I mean, the way I see it, a lawmaker acting in accordance with his own laws doesn't really take away from his power. So, the Creator has set a law and acts in accordance with it. This doesn't create a situation where his power needs to be questioned.
Absolutely, this doesn't mean there's any deficiency in his power. But as I said, when it comes to the concept of God in relation to humans, in other words, in the relationship between an infinite power and a limited one, when you transfer some of that power to the human, the Ash'ari theology has always tried to block this. You try to make his will free, but they say this would limit God's will. You try to give him some power, saying that even before he acts, before he takes any action, he has a preliminary power. They say no. That power is only created by God when he actually turns toward the action. But the concept of human actually encompasses all of this. It encompasses all of this. When you say human, it means he has power, he has will, he has the desire for power. That's how God designed him. Why do you perceive this as something that opposes God's power, as if it's a rival force against him? There's no such possibility. No human has such a possibility, power, or might. This is actually a point where Mutazilite and Maturidi theology seriously diverge from Ash'ari theology, but today, without getting into theological debates, we tried to analyze these two words a bit in the context of the Quran.
Thank you very much, Professor. It really was a difficult issue.
It's a difficult issue, but I think it's understandable.
Agreed. Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Dear viewers, today we tried to examine the concepts of wisdom and power in the context of the Holy Quran. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.